It started with a flat tire. I was on my way to a friend's wedding in northern Vermont, a 6-hour drive from my home in Pennsylvania, when my car decided to give up on me somewhere in the middle of upstate New York. The wedding was in less than 4 hours, and my spare tire was flatter than my mood. I pulled into a small gas station off the highway, hoping for a miracle. The attendant, a wiry man in his 60s, shook his head when I asked if they had a replacement. "Closest place is 30 miles from here," he said, as if that was the most normal thing in the world. I was sitting on the curb, staring at my phone and debating whether to call for a tow or just abandon my plans altogether, when a beat-up green van pulled up. Out stepped a guy who looked like he belonged in a 1970s rock band, long hair, leather jacket, and an easy smile. "You look stranded," he said, leaning against the van. "Brilliant deduction," I replied, waving at my deflated tire. He laughed and introduced himself as Mark. He was heading north, he said, and could give me a lift if I was desperate. Normally, I'd never accept a ride from a stranger, but something about his demeanor made me hesitate. He didn't seem threatening, just a little eccentric. And I was out of options. "Okay," I said, after a moment's thought. "But if you're a serial killer, at least let me text my friend your license plate first." He grinned. "Fair deal." And just like that, I found myself in the passenger seat of his van, hurtling down a rural highway with a stranger who smelled faintly of patchouli and coffee. Mark was a talker. Within minutes, I knew his entire life story, or at least the version he chose to share. He was a carpenter, originally from Michigan, traveling to see his sister in Burlington. He'd been living out of his van for the past 6 months, chasing freedom, as he put it. "What about you?" he asked, glancing at me. "Not much to tell," I replied. "Going to a wedding. Car broke down." "That's it," he said, raising an eyebrow. I shrugged. "Pretty much." For a while, we rode in companionable silence, the kind that feels natural even though you've just met. The landscape outside shifted from rolling fields to dense forests, the sun casting long shadows across the road. It wasn't until we stopped for gas that things took an unexpected turn. Mark was inside paying when an older woman approached me at the pump. She was petite, with silver hair pulled into a bun and kind eyes that seemed to study me intently. "Excuse me," she said, her voice hesitant. "You look familiar. Have we met before?" I shook my head. "I don't think so." She frowned, her gaze narrowing. "What's your name?" "Ben," I said. Her expression softened, and for a moment, she looked as though she might cry. "You look just like my brother when he was your age." "Your brother?" "Yes," she said, smiling sadly. "His name was William. He passed away many years ago." "You really do look like him." I didn't know what to say. The coincidence was strange, but I chalked it up to chance. People see resemblances all the time, right? When Mark returned, the woman glanced at him, then back at me. "Take care, young man," she said, giving me a gentle pat on the arm before walking away. Mark noticed my puzzled expression as we pulled back onto the road. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Yeah," I said, though I wasn't sure if it was true. A few hours later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Mark suggested stopping for dinner at a diner he swore had the best pie in the state. Over greasy burgers and coffee, we started talking about family. Mark mentioned he hadn't seen his sister in years. "Family's complicated," he said, stirring his coffee. "Tell me about it," I replied. And then, almost without thinking, I told him about the woman at the gas station. Something about her had unsettled me, though I couldn't explain why. Mark listened quietly, his face thoughtful. When I finished, he leaned back and said, "Maybe it's a sign." "A sign of what?" "I don't know. But sometimes the universe has a way of connecting dots we didn't even know existed." I laughed, though his words stayed with me. We reached the wedding just in time for the reception. Mark dropped me off with a wave and a cheerful, "Good luck," before disappearing into the night. The wedding was beautiful, but my mind kept drifting back to the strange encounter at the gas station. When I got home a few days later, I dug out an old family album, flipping through pages until I found a photo of my grandfather as a young man. My heart skipped a beat. The resemblance between him and the man the woman described was uncanny. Could it be possible? Had I just met someone connected to my family's past by pure chance? I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. Over the next few weeks, I did some digging, tracing my grandfather's history and reaching out to distant relatives. What I discovered was astonishing. My grandfather had a younger sister who he'd lost touch with after a family feud decades ago. And her name? Margaret. I couldn't help but wonder, was the woman at the gas station my great-aunt? And if so, what were the odds of meeting her on a random road trip with a stranger? To this day, I don't have all the answers. But that weekend changed how I see the world. It reminded me that life is full of unexpected connections and that sometimes, taking a chance, whether it's accepting a ride from a stranger or following a hunch, can lead to something extraordinary. Second story. I don't usually do impulsive. I'm the type who double-checks the stove, the locks, and even the itinerary for a trip I've planned months in advance. But last summer, a single mix-up at JFK Airport threw my carefully curated routine out the window and led to one of the most surreal weeks of my life. It started on a Tuesday. I had just flown back to New York from a business trip in Chicago, running on 3 hours of sleep and way too much coffee. My suitcase, a black Samsonite with a worn luggage tag, was supposed to come off the carousel at baggage claim. Instead, I found myself staring at an identical bag, but with a tag that clearly didn't have my name on it. Great, I muttered, pulling it off the carousel to inspect it more closely. Before I could flag down an airport employee, someone tapped me on the shoulder. "Excuse me," said a voice. I turned to see a woman, mid-30s, with dark curls tucked into a messy bun. She was holding my suitcase. We stared at each other for a moment, realizing what had happened. "Yours?" she asked, holding up my bag. "Looks like it," I said, holding up hers. We swapped suitcases, exchanged sheepish apologies, and were about to go our separate ways when she hesitated. "Hey," she said, "I don't suppose you're heading to Manhattan?" "Yeah," I replied. "My ride bailed on me," she explained. "Would you mind sharing a cab? I'll cover the fare." Under normal circumstances, I would have politely declined. But something about her, maybe the tired but friendly look in her eyes, made me agree. We introduced ourselves on the ride into the city. Her name was Claire, a freelance photographer who'd just returned from a shoot in Denver. We talked about work, travel, and the absurdity of airport chaos. By the time we reached my stop in Midtown, it felt like I'd known her longer than an hour. "You sure you don't want me to chip in?" I asked as I stepped out of the cab. "Nope," she said with a grin. "Just promise me one thing, check your suitcase. Make sure it's really yours this time." I laughed, gave her a quick wave, and walked into my building. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Hey, it's Claire. So, funny story. I think we swapped something else." Confused, I opened my suitcase. Everything seemed fine until I unzipped the inner compartment and found a manila envelope that definitely wasn't mine. Inside were a series of black and white photographs, cityscapes, candid portraits, and what looked like an outdoor festival. "Is this what you're missing?" I texted back, attaching a photo of the envelope. "Yep," she replied. "And I think I've got your presentation notes." I groaned. My entire pitch for a meeting with a potential client was in that envelope. We agreed to meet that afternoon at a cafe in the East Village to exchange our misplaced items. When I arrived, Claire was already there, sipping an iced coffee and flipping through my notes with an amused expression. "These are good," she said, holding up a page. "You've got a knack for storytelling." "Glad you think so," I said, sitting down. "Now, can I have them back?" She handed me the envelope, and I returned her photographs. But instead of leaving, we ended up staying for another 2 hours, talking about everything from our favorite books to the weirdest things we'd ever found in airport security lines. By the end of the day, she had convinced me to tag along to a photography exhibit she was planning to attend later that week. "You'll love it," she said. "And it's the least I can do after swiping your notes." I almost said no. Work was piling up, and I wasn't the type to spend a Thursday evening at an art gallery. But something about Claire's enthusiasm was infectious. The exhibit was just the beginning. Over the next week, we ended up crossing paths more than I could have anticipated. A random coffee meetup turned into a full afternoon wandering through Central Park. A simple exchange of text recommendations led to an impromptu dinner at a hole-in-the-wall taco place she swore by. Each encounter felt both unexpected and strangely inevitable, as if the universe was nudging us together. It wasn't until our last night hanging out on the steps of the Brooklyn Bridge, watching the city lights flicker across the water, that I realized how much my perspective had shifted. "You know," Claire said, breaking the comfortable silence, "this is the first time in a long while I've felt grounded." Grounded? Yeah. Life's been so chaotic lately. But this week, meeting you, all of this, it's reminded me why I love what I do. Why I love people. I didn't know how to respond. The truth was, I felt the same way. The next morning, she left for a new assignment in Europe. We promised to keep in touch, but deep down, I knew our paths might never cross again. It's been months since that week, and life has returned to its usual rhythm. But every now and then, I think about Claire and the strange, serendipitous chain of events that brought us together. She taught me something important, that sometimes, the best moments in life aren't planned. They happen when you let go of control, trust a stranger, and embrace the unexpected. Third story. It was just a regular Wednesday morning when I found myself walking into my favorite local coffee shop, exhausted from a long night of work. I was on autopilot, as usual, get the coffee, check my phone, and keep moving. The world around me seemed like a blur. I hadn't expected anything unusual that day, let alone what would happen next. I walked up to the counter, ready to order my usual, when I noticed a woman standing next to me, looking down at the menu. She was holding a large tote bag, the kind that always seemed to say I'm a creative person with my life together. Her dark hair was pulled back into a messy bun, and her glasses were perched on the edge of her nose. "Are you going to order?" she asked me, her voice breaking through my thoughts. I turned to face her, startled. "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to take so long." She smiled, but there was something in her eyes that made me pause. Something I couldn't quite place. "No worries," she said. "I'm just not sure what to get. Any recommendations?" I wasn't particularly a coffee connoisseur, but I figured I'd share my go-to order. I'd say the iced caramel macchiato is great. Sweet, but not overwhelming. "Thanks, I'll try that," she said, ordering from the barista. It was then that something strange happened. The barista accidentally handed her my order, a hot Americano instead of the iced macchiato. And she, somehow, took it. I think you have my order," I said, slightly confused. She looked at the cup in her hands, then back at me, realizing her mistake. "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I must have grabbed the wrong one." I was distracted. We both laughed awkwardly as the barista corrected the mistake and handed me my iced caramel macchiato. "No problem," I said, smiling. "I'll take the coffee if you want to keep the Americano." Her eyes widened. "Wait, really? Are you sure?" "Yeah, it's fine," I said with a shrug. "I mean, coffee is coffee, right?" She looked at me, hesitant for a moment, then smiled. "Well, okay then. Thanks. I'm kind of in a rush, so this works out." She grabbed the Americano and headed toward the door. I watched her leave, a little confused by the odd encounter, but brushing it off as a minor blip in my otherwise routine morning. Little did I know that this moment, this simple misunderstanding, would spark a chain of events that would change my entire week, and ultimately, my life. Later that afternoon, I received a text. "Hey, it's the Americano girl from this morning. I can't believe I didn't get your name. I owe you a coffee." How about I make it up to you by grabbing one this weekend? I froze, unsure how to respond. I couldn't remember the last time a stranger had contacted me like this. My instinct was to dismiss it, but something inside me pushed me to reply. I texted back, sure, I guess that sounds good. The weekend came, and I found myself at the same coffee shop, sitting at the same table where we'd met earlier. She walked in on time, looking much more relaxed than when I'd seen her earlier in the week. "Hey, stranger," she called out with a grin. "Sorry for the random text earlier. I just thought I should follow through and buy you that coffee." I stood up to greet her. "No worries. Honestly, it's a bit random, but here I am." We sat down, and it didn't take long before the conversation started flowing. We talked about work, our hobbies, and what brought us to that particular coffee shop. I found myself genuinely enjoying the conversation, something I didn't often experience when meeting new people. As we continued talking, I learned that her name was Laura. She worked as a freelance writer, mostly doing content creation for companies in the tech industry. Her schedule was chaotic, with deadlines creeping up on her all the time, but she seemed content with her lifestyle. Laura was different from anyone I had met in a while. She was confident and spontaneous in a way I wasn't used to, and she had a way of making everything seem interesting. "You know," she said, sipping her latte, "I've always wanted to just take off somewhere and get lost for a few days. Disconnect completely." I laughed. "Sounds like a dream. I don't think I'd ever have the guts to do that." "Well, maybe that's where I come in," she said, her eyes twinkling. "You could join me." "Join you?" I asked, puzzled. "Yeah, I'm thinking of taking a short trip. You know, somewhere local but different. A change of scenery. Could be fun." For a moment, I hesitated. I didn't know this woman. And the idea of dropping everything for a spontaneous trip sounded ridiculous. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how stagnant my life had become. I had no real hobbies, and every day felt like I was living in a loop of work and routine. Maybe it was time for something different. The following week, Laura and I found ourselves in a small coastal town just a couple of hours outside of the city. We stayed in a modest Airbnb, tucked away in the woods. No Wi-Fi, no distractions, just us, our books, and the sound of the waves crashing in the distance. It wasn't a grand adventure, but it was everything I needed. We spent the days hiking, eating local seafood, and talking about everything and nothing at all. We learned about each other's lives in ways I hadn't expected. I opened up more in those few days than I had in years. We talked about our fears, our dreams, and everything that had shaped us into the people we were. It felt like we had known each other for much longer than just a few days. The walls I had built around myself started to crumble, piece by piece. By the time we returned to the city, I felt like a different person. The quiet, peaceful week had given me perspective. I realized I had been living too much in my head, too focused on routine and comfort. Life wasn't meant to be controlled, it was meant to be lived, with all its unpredictability. Laura and I kept in touch after our trip, and although we weren't close friends, I knew I would never forget the lessons I had learned from her. Sometimes, the best moments in life come when you take a leap of faith, when you embrace the unexpected, and when you let yourself go beyond your comfort zone. That coffee shop encounter, that simple misunderstanding, had sparked something in me, a desire for change, adventure, and new beginnings. And as I look back on that week, I realize how one small moment can have a ripple effect, transforming your life in ways you never imagined.